Welcome to Hormone Circuits. There's hormones in the thyroid that can help us feel at ease. But the thyroid's like a magnet for autoimmune disease. Why do we attack ourselves? Oh, we'd like to know. And in this course I will explain because I love you so. Hormones, hormones, hormones here and there. Hormones, 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 hormones everywhere. Hormones, 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 hormones everywhere. Cha-cha-cha. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Hormone Circuits Lecture 10, Autoimmune Diseases. Why? In the last lecture, let's first take a nice deep sigh of relief. That's good against to ward off autoimmune diseases, stress-related. Autoimmune diseases are stress-related. Maybe we'll try to understand why. And, last time we talked about the thyroid gland and its discontents, and the thyroid is like a magnet for autoimmune diseases. T cells come to the thyroid cells and detect little pieces of normal proteins that the thyroid makes, like thyroglobulin and TPO, and detects them with its T cell receptor, and thinks this thyroid cell must be infected by a virus, as if those perfectly healthy little antigens come from a virus. And the T cell takes out its dagger, does what a T cell has to do, and kills the thyroid cell. The pituitary and thyroid can compensate until a certain point, but this killing is relentless. And in many people, a few percent of mostly women, but also men, a vast fraction of the population ends up with not enough thyroid hormones, hypothyroidism. If untreated, it could be potentially lethal. Treatment is by these thyroid hormone pill supplements. And we have Hashimoto's, thyroiditis, and autoimmune disease. This disease is so common in a few percent of the people, and can happen at young ages. It can happen in puberty, it can happen in pregnancy, in reproductive age, a huge evolutionary cost. Why does it exist? Why didn't evolution find ways to counter it? What is the logic behind autoimmune diseases that attack endocrine glands like the thyroid? It's not the only one. We remember about type 1 diabetes, Sukeret Nurim, where on average during puberty, let's say age 14, 1%, it's equal between men and women, 1% of the population, T cells with a different T cell receptor go into the beta cells that make insulin and detect little pieces of the protein that is cut to become insulin, pre-proinsulin, and decide this beta cell is doomed to death. And the T cells relentlessly kill beta cells until the child has no insulin, comes into the clinic with glucose 400 or with a hyperglycemia, and until 100 years ago when Banting and Best synthesized or discovered insulin, so you can inject insulin and save these kids would die. So 1% of children would die. Again, a huge evolutionary cost. So Hashimoto's thyroiditis and type 1 diabetes are extremely common and lethal diseases where the body attacks itself. T cells that normally are supposed to sense proteins against viruses, we all have T cells that sense proteins normally made by the thyroid and by beta cells, but only a small fraction, a few percent, this turns into autoimmune disease that kills the organ. So and at the same equally, so one thing we'll ask is why is there autoimmune disease? And another interesting question is, not all hormone glands get attacked by autoimmune disease. There are some that don't get attacked. For example, on top of the thyroid, are 4 little glands called parathyroid. And they secrete a hormone called PTH, parathyroid hormone. And parathyroid hormone is important for calcium balance. These parathyroid glands are also an endocrine gland. They're also a hormone secreting gland, but they virtually never get an autoimmune disease. Virtually never get an autoimmune disease, except in rare mutations in certain drugs, never get autoimmune disease. Another example is right next to the beta cells, there are alpha cells that secrete glucagon. There's almost no known autoimmune disease of alpha cells, but yes, of beta cells. What's so special? Are there rules for which tissue, which organ gets a disease? What's going on here? This is our goal of the lecture, these questions. And I want to present to you, let's take a nice deep sigh of relief. I want to present to you a theory that offers answers to these questions and poses new experiments to do. The reference for this theory is Crohn et al. Immunity 2020. So you can read this paper and know more. Okay. Let's get going. There's hormones in the thyroid that can make us feel at ease, but the thyroid's like a magnet for autoimmune disease. So what is the current, like, normal way of thinking of autoimmune diseases? Normal thinking is that they are an error in checkpoint mechanisms and tolerance mechanisms that evolved to avoid having T cells that attack healthy cells. So the body has ways called tolerance mechanisms eliminate self-reactive T cells. And that's true. That's why most organs in our body are not attacked. I should say right away that when we talk about autoimmune disease, there's 2 major classes. One is these systemic or non-organ specific autoimmune diseases like lupus and rheumatoid arthritis, which has to do with antibody complexes that pile up in different tissues. Terrible, devastating diseases, but I'm not going to discuss them today. I am going to discuss organ-specific autoimmune diseases, where it's a specific cell type that's attacked by T cells and causes a specific function. And a lot of those are hormone-secreting glands. So tolerance mechanism eliminates self-reactive T cells against the brain, against muscles, against liver, against it. And that's great. And there's 2 major kinds. One is in an organ sitting here called the thymus. And in the thymus, the T cells develop. They're made in the bone marrow and go to the thymus. That's where they're called T cells. T is for thymus. And each T cell has its own T cell receptor. And the thymocytes cells present pieces of normal protein from all over the body. And if the T cell binds very strongly, it means it's self-reactive, it's killed. If it doesn't bind anything, it's also killed. It's probably not a good T cell. And if it binds kind of intermediately, it's also can be turned into a regulatory T cell, which inhibits killer T cells. So there's also this kind of regulatory T cells that we'll talk about that inhibits, so killer T cells. So T cells that recognize self-protein very strongly, they're eliminated or turned into police kind of T cells that inhibit So that's very nice. And indeed, mutations in the thymus, like a famous one is called AIR, where the thymus can't present these peptides, they can't express them. Mutations in the thymus, which are very rare. If you're born with such a mutation, very rare, let's say 1 in a million, you get type 1 diabetes and Hashimoto's and a lot of autoimmune diseases. So indeed, this is very important to tolerance. And mutations in Tregs also cause autoimmune diseases. So these are definitely important. So for tuning the immune system not to attack the body. Right? By the way, this is a great time for questions. If you have a question, go to the keyboard, open the chat, and chat me a question. And I'll know if I'm being clear, because or if you're curious about something, this is the time to do that, to chat me a question, maybe something already comes to mind. And I'm hoping that one of you is typing right now, maybe Ophir, maybe Dror Bar, maybe Doron Klinger. One of you maybe is going to type a question so we can progress and continue with the lecture and get to the bottom of autoimmune diseases. I am just a T-cell and my story is seldom told. Educated in the thymus, I learned how to defend my country. Laying low, seeking out those lymph nodes where the other T-cells go, seeking out the places only they will know. 999, 999, 999, 999. If you want me to stop singing, this is the time to ask a question. 999, 999. Actually, there's no question. I think I'm gonna. Do you guys have a question? Wow, it's so clear, crystal clear. Somebody. How age affects the autoimmune disease process? So are autoimmune diseases age-related? So type 1 diabetes is a disease of the young, but also has a late-acting component in some people. Thyroiditis can happen in the young, but I think overall increases with age. And overall, with age, actually what happens is the T-cell part of the immune system gets weaker, and the innate part, macrophages stuff, gets stronger. There's kind of a shift. The thymus atrophies and stops making new T cells, more or less. So all in all, you would expect that age would ameliorate or slow down autoimmune diseases, but that doesn't always happen. I hope I answered your question. Okay, great. So the normal way of thinking is that autoimmune disease are a mistake, some mistake here, yeah. And by the way, even if there's a T cell that goes out of the thymus by mistake, it can still be eliminated by what's called peripheral tolerance, where if this self-reactive T cell meets so much self-antigen, because it's present all over the body, so it gets activated too much activation leads to activity toxicity. So cells that are overactivated also get killed. So that's another way for peripheral tolerance to happen. And that's a kind of biphasic response. Too little activity and too much activity can kill T cells in the thymus, and too much activity can kill T cells in the periphery. So general thinking is that autoimmune diseases are a mistake. And maybe genetic factors predispose some people to have more mistakes, and that's why you have genetic, like in the family, the disease runs in the family. So we're going to take a different point of view. We're going to try out, I think you can begin by thinking it's a mistake, but it's a mistake to begin by thinking things are a mistake, because maybe there is a logic. And if you think if things are a mistake in the beginning, you miss the chance to find the logic. So we're going to find a theory for the logic of the physiological role. So we're going to think that actually autoimmunity has a helpful, essential physiological role. In other words, without these T cells that attack self, you can't live, can't survive. And in some fraction of people, this very important role, it has a fragility of autoimmune disease. It's the price you pay for an otherwise essential process. Hope I explained myself. And now I hope you're curious, what is this essential physiological role? So the question is, are autoimmune diseases age-related diseases? I wouldn't say they're age-related diseases like Alzheimer, which you basically never get at age 20, unless you have some mutations or something, and goes up exponentially with age, and typically it happens in the 80s. But there's lots of diseases like that. Okay, liver, like autoimmune diseases, these kinds often can also happen in young, like age 14, 11, 5. Very rarely you see Alzheimer in 5-year-olds, but you see type 1 diabetes or thyroiditis, pregnancy, reproductive age. That said, they do have also another, like they have a peak or high prevalence at young ages, and then they also have old age appearance as well. So they do have an age-related component, but they're not age-related diseases where age is like a major driving force. I hope I explained myself. Unlike Alzheimer's, by the way, we have in our lab, we study aging and age-related diseases, and there is a paper by Katsir, Aging Cell 2021, that demystifies why all these age-related diseases like Alzheimer's, cancer rise at about 6 to 8% per year, all very similar rates, and then drop actually at very old ages, where the incidence drops. If you want to understand that, you can take a look at this paper. All right. Okay, so let's give our theory. All right. The theory is like this. Basically, the idea is that T cells can eliminate hyper-secreting mutant cells. Let's flesh out this idea. So first of all, we notice that all these autoimmune diseases of endocrine organs share an underlying circuit that we've seen in this lecture. Shared circuit. Beta cells secrete insulin that controls glucose. And glucose makes the beta cells secrete insulin and divide. Secrete and divide. Thyrocytes secrete thyroid hormone under control of TSH that makes the thyrocytes secrete and divide. And we also studied the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland secretes cortisol under control of ACTH. This is X2, X3. ACTH is also the growth factor for the adrenal. So the same circuit, and each one has the disease, type 1 diabetes, Hashimoto, and the adrenal has what's called Addison's disease, where T cells attack adrenal cortex cells that secrete cortisol and kill them, and then you have Addisonian crisis, no cortisol, blood pressure, you die quite quickly from lack of cortisol. All right. And then the Curate supplement, hydrocortisone pills supplement, people can survive with Addison's, supplement thyroid hormones, you should survive with Hashimoto, supplement insulin, type 1 diabetes. The miracle of endocrinology in the 20th century, isolation of these hormones, they save millions of lives every year because you can supplement. There's other diseases too. I'm now going to just list them to give you a breadth of these autoimmune diseases. There's the cholangiocytes in the liver under control of secretin. They make bicarbonate in water to make the bile flow, and secretin makes them secrete and divide. And there's a disease PBC where they're killed and you have bile problems. There's the gastrin cells, parietal cells that make acid in your stomach under control of the hormone gastrin, and gastrin makes them secrete and divide. There's pernicious anemia, which is an autoimmune disease where you lose your acid, and that has a problem with vitamin B12, and then you get some anemia, pernicious anemia. There's vitiligo, where melanocytes in the skin are attacked, and you get white patches like that. Again, T cells attack melanocytes, same circuit, and on and on. So autoimmune diseases share this divide and secrete circuit, which makes a lot of sense. Organ size control. If you don't have enough hormone, you increase the gland. Dynamic compensation, all the principles we learned, the circuit is so important. And as we've seen before, this circuit also has a fragility. The fragility is for hypersecreting mutants. So if you have a mutant cell that thinks that there's too much glucose, it will secrete more and divide more. So if you have your beta cells happily secreting insulin, and then there's a mutant that thinks there's too much glucose, says, oh, we need more insulin, it'll start making a lot of insulin and dividing. And pretty soon you have too much insulin. Too much insulin, too low glucose. Too low glucose, below 3 millimolar, you're dead. So these are fragile to hyper sensing mutants. So in general, you have a cell, there's a signal that makes it secrete and divide. They sense too much signal. They think there's a lot of signal, and then they divide and make what's called an adenoma, which is a little not a cancer, but it's like a growth of cells that hypersecrete, and this can kill you. We've seen an example in the thyroid. There was these thyroid toxic nodules. These cells are mutants in their TSH receptor, and they think there's too much TSH, and therefore divide. And over the years, this is an age-related disease. It takes more time to grow. You get a hypersecreting thyroid nodule. You get hyperthyroidism, and that, as we said, heart problems can potentially be lethal. So there's 50 known mutations in the TSH receptor that make it think there's more TSH than there really is, and when you sequence these tumors, there's 50 different mutations that different patients have, at least 50 different mutations, TSH receptor. All right. So we've seen one way to get rid of those mutants. We've seen in the course, which is called biphasic mutant resistance. I just want to go over that. This is let's say the amount of glucose, and this is the growth minus death rate of beta cells. And we saw that it looks like this. So if you have a cell that thinks, this is the mutant cell, that thinks there's too much glucose, it kills itself. However, this still leaves all these mutants here. If instead of 5 millimolar, the cell thinks there's 8 millimolar because of mutation in glucokinase, it'll grow and make a clone. So these range of hypersensing mutants that think the glucose is higher, not 25 millimolar, but it's 8 millimolar, there's still a problem. And also in the thyroid, TSH, in the same growth rate, there's no biphasic. So the thyroid has no biphasic mechanism at all because TSH needs to vary over 1,000-fold, and there's no TSH toxicity. So thyroid needs a different mechanism, and the beta cells need a mechanism for these mild mutants, and the parathyroid needs a mechanism because it also has biphasic, but also the mild mutants. So mutants are a problem. And what I'm proposing is T cells can eliminate these mutants. They can give them a selective disadvantage and cause these mutants, clones, to actually not start growing. Once, by the way, they grow beyond a certain size, you're going to get a toxic nodule. But in the beginning, to eliminate them. So, no? Okay. So one question is, how do you avoid these T cells to go to other organs? So we're going to see these T cells are very specific. They're going to attack a specific thyroid, specific protein. So if they go to other organs, they're not going to attack anything. So they have the T cell receptor. Each T cell has a T cell receptor that's very specific. And so these, let's say, specific autoreactive T cells eliminate the hypersecreting. Another question is a drastic way to control hormone levels. So that's a thought. Yeah? And how can we understand Crohn's disease? Okay, so Crohn's disease is also an immune disease, autoimmune disease of the gut, but it's different. It's not T cells killing gut cells, but more like hyperactivity of the T cell because of some allergy-like components. So it's also an autoimmune disease, but not of the same kind that we're discussing here. Not psoriasis is the same, and so there's other causes. But let's say it's called immune hyperactivity diseases. I hope I explained myself. Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, IBD, etc. All right. Okay, so let's go deeper. Let's go deeper. So, yeah. Yeah, that's correct. So autoimmune diseases are not only organ-specific T cell diseases and not systemic antibody-based diseases. There's also diseases of hyperactivity like psoriasis and IBD, ulcerative colitis, and there's other kinds of autoimmune diseases. In this lecture, I'm focusing on T cell-mediated organ-specific diseases that plague the hormone system and other glands like that, which are a major fraction of autoimmune diseases are of that nature. Arthritis, yeah, rheumatoid arthritis is also an autoimmune disease that's also not of this class. It has to do with also antibody complexes and inflammation, other mechanisms. But multiple sclerosis, where T cells attack oligodendrocytes and form, is in this class. Okay, so multiple sclerosis. So if somebody's going to ask about MS, also in this class. All right, so this is like a lot of nice questions. I'm going to take a little rehydration. Let's take a nice deep sigh of relief. Okay, so how common are these mutants? Are very common. In fact, they're inevitable. I just want to make a little calculation with you. So the thyroid is 10 grams. 10 grams is 10 to the 10 cells. I want to calculate how many mutants there are. In order to make 10 to the 10 cells, you need at least 10 to the 10 divisions, because each cell comes from a division. It's not a logarithmic thing. It's at least 10 to the 10 cell divisions. Mutation rate, so every letter in our genome, whenever there's a division, there's a certain chance it'll change, and that's a point mutation, is 10 to the minus 9 per division per base pair, which means once the thyroid is developed to 10 grams, there's going to be 10 examples of a cell, 10 cells with any given point mutation. Now I told you there's at least 50 TSH receptor mutations that give rise to toxic nodules. at least 50 different ones. So that means there will be at least 10 times 50 equals 500 toxic nodules in each person on average. That means that as we're born being a human being, part of a human condition, our thyroid is going to have 500 toxic nodules, and basically we won't make it very far. So these mutants are inevitable. They're extremely common. Also in the beta cells, where there's 10 to the 9 cells, there'll be dozens of these clones making too much insulin. And therefore, it's a question, how can you even have endocrine organs, given that they have this feedback loop for organ size control and compensation and fragile to mutations, and you always get mutations in organs of this size. Okay, so it's unavoidable. It's essential to get rid of the mutants. So are common and in fact unavoidable in organs of above 10 to the 9 cells or something like that, or 10 to the 8 cells, in organs above 1 gram. So maybe mice don't have this problem. They have only 10 to the 6 beta cells, don't have this problem so much. All right, so let's propose that the T cells, that evolution helped the tolerance mechanism not eliminate T cells that are specific to certain proteins, where they can tell which cell is hypersecreting and kill it. So we need to say that T cells can recognize hypersecreting mutant cells. And you can think maybe T cells can recognize fast dividing cells, but it's hard to tell which cell divides faster than the other, especially if they divide, let's say, once per month. But there's a better way to do that, and that is that the T cells, in order to do that, can look for antigens, autoantigens, right, at the end of the production pathway of the hormone. So you have, for instance, in the thyrocytes, you remember there's these proteins TG and TPO, thyroglobulin and peroxide, and they're right at the end of making thyroid hormone. So what happens, in order to tell which cell is hypersecreting, the hypersecreting cell is going to have a lot more of these proteins. All cells, as I told you, present random pieces of the proteins on these MHC molecules. So what happens is that the prediction is that the autoantigens, that is to say, the T cells that do this surveillance are going to recognize things like TG, the protein that's the very end. It's cut to make thyroid hormone. So that's a prediction. And when you look at all these diseases, that prediction is met. So in the Hashimoto, it's TG and TPO are the two big antigens that the T cells attack. In type 1 diabetes, it's pro-insulin. It's the protein that's cut to make insulin, and some other proteins at the end of the insulin synthesis pathways. In Addison, which is adrenal, it's 21-hydroxylase, which is the last enzyme in this pathway to make cortisol. That's the antigen. So you look disease after disease, and you find that, as the theory predicts, what the T cells attack is specific to that organ, and it's the very end of the synthesis pathway to make the hormone. So that's a prediction that's certainly met by all these autoimmune diseases, and explains why these antigens, because thyroid cells make hundreds of proteins that are specific to the thyroid that no other tissue makes, but it's only these TG and TPO that are attacked in the autoimmune disease. So okay. Great. So now the second thing we need is, in order to kill these mutants, you need that the T cells avoid killing the healthy cells. So we need to differentiate. And the way you can do that is by counting according to amount of presented antigen. So T cells should be able to do the following thing. If hypersecreting mutant cell presents, let's say, 100 Tg peptides, a healthy cell, let's say, presents only 10, the T cell should be able to tell the difference and kill the hypersecreting mutant and not the healthy cell. Can the immune system do that? So when you look at T cells, you see that the T cells that are most widely studied, like against viruses, like against influenza, are very strong binders. It's not self-proteins. And sometimes it's enough to see, for them to see even one peptide presented to kill. But these are T cells itself, and they undergo tolerance, etc. Most T cells aren't so strong. They're moderate binders, and moderate binders can do that. So if this is the amount of antigen per cell presented, right? 1, 3, 10, 30. And this is the killing rate of the T cell. Then you get something like that. You get that the killing goes like antigen to the power n, where n is like 3 to 5. So it's a kind of like a Hill function, or a kind of cooperative. And you can tell the difference between 3, 10, and 30 antigens presented on the cell surface. And there's thousands of MHCs, and they present all kinds of peptides randomly picked from the proteins, so that the hypersecreting ones will have, 2, 3, 5 times, 10 times more thyroglobulin, and T cells can get rid of those mutants, giving them a selective disadvantage. So T cells can definitely do that. And okay, so we understood why, this theory explains why these specific antigens, when you have Hashimoto's, the way the doctors diagnose you is by looking and seeing that you have antibodies against TG and TPO. And they're very famous antigens. So why those at the end of the pathway? And we can know that immune cells have this graded killing, so they can tell the difference by counting basically antigen and kill the hypersecreting cells. Maybe they also kill a little bit of healthy cells. That's collateral damage. And now we can ask, one thing we might be worried about is what happens if all the thyroid cells start secreting more thyroid hormone? Let's say, for instance, we don't have iodine in the diet, or we have some situation where all the cells need to secrete more thyroid hormones. This is especially in beta cells, right? Suppose we have insulin resistance and all the beta cells secrete more insulin. Why doesn't the immune system then attack all the beta cells? Because if it can count antigens, suddenly all the cells make more. How can it avoid killing healthy cells if all the tissue makes more? And here we can have, we have the design of the immune system. So the immune system can gets used to the background. Or in other words, it adapts. And the way that works is, what is to say that if all the cells make more antigen, there's something that accordingly reduces the activity, and that thing is regulatory T cells. So antigen makes the T cells more active. It also makes the regulatory T cells more active, and they inhibit the T cells. So if you have more antigen, as all the cells are making more hormone, T cells kill more, but also the regulatory T cells stop them. So actually, the killing is a function of the antigen divided by the average antigen. This is average in the tissue. So if all the tissue makes more, there's more Tregs, and therefore T cells have a higher baseline, and now they look for ratios. They look for ratios. Which cell has 3 times more than its neighbor? And that's a very important aspect of the immune system, fold change detection. It detects relative changes, and that's how it can avoid acting at the wrong time. By the way, viruses and bacteria, they grow exponentially. they are very easy for the immune system to detect for this reason, because if you go exponentially, you can never adapt. They grow by a factor of 2, and then by a factor of 4, and then 8 and 16, and that's why exponentially growing threats like cancer, bacteria, viruses, exponentially growing threats trigger the immune system. But very slowly growing threats, the immune system can adapt, and that's an interesting theory by Eduardo Sontag, fold change detection in the immune system that allows it to sense exponential threats. And this very same property can help it adapt to changes in the hormones and keep this surveillance under control. By the way, we need a name for it. Autoimmune surveillance of hyper-secreting mutants, or Hashem. Okay. So that's what we'll call it. So Tregs keep ASHM under control. Any questions? I'm sure I'm giving you a lot of information. We can take a nice deep sigh of relief. We see we did welcome, breath, and review, type 1 diabetes and Hashimoto. We talked about immune tolerance in the thymus and regulatory T cells, the circuit that's shared by all autoimmune diseases, the mutants, fragility of the circuit, the fact that these mutants are unavoidable, the biphasic control mechanism, ASHM, the antigen in the end of the secretion pathway, the differential sensing, the way that regulatory T cells can prevent activation if all the tissue makes more hormone. And by the way, this theory also explains why experiments have been showing over decades that every healthy individual has T cells against pre-proinsulin, against thyroglobulin, against TPO. We all have self-reactive T cells. In fact, they're part of what's called the public T cell receptors, identical T cell receptors. Most T cell receptors are different between individuals, so we have a wide repertoire, but there's also a fraction which are shared. They're called public T cell receptors, exact same sequence. And among them are the T cells that are autoreactive. So that explains why we all have this physiological function, because it's so essential. And now we get to a point where it's useful to have a mathematical model. I mean, so far we can do this all with words, but the following question really requires a mathematical model, which is detailed in the lecture notes, but I just want to give you the details. Another thing we want this ASHM to do is to not to kill huge amounts of cells just to eliminate mutants. Imagine that you killed every month half of your beta cells, but then you'd have a lot of inflammation and problems. It seems crazy. So it's much better if it kills, 1% of the beta cells every month or something like that. In other words, it's 007 secret agent rather than a riot police, okay? And so can you give a selective disadvantage to mutants with a very low killing rate? In order to do that, you need a mathematical model. And since we have a lot of ignorance about the immune system, it needs to be the simplest possible model that has the essentials. And you'll see that in the lecture notes. It uses this kind of killing rate. Yeah. And it has a parameter K, let's call it, which is how strong the killing rate is. If K is very strong, you kill basically so many cells that you can't make enough hormone and you get type 1 diabetes or Hashimoto's. The question is for low K compared to the natural turnover, can you give a selective disadvantage to all possible mutants? And the answer is yes. So the model shows that ASHM works, that is to say, eliminates all mutants. If K is on the order of 1/2n, n is the cooperativity. So it could be about K divided by, natural turnover. So killing by T cells as a fraction of the natural removal of the cells can be of order of 10%, and you still eliminate all mutants for this level of cooperativity. The more cooperative it is, the less killing you need, because discrimination is better. But that presents other problems. So the mathematical model here is important. If it didn't work, I wouldn't believe this theory. I would say like the simple model would say that you have to kill 10 times more than the natural turnover rate. I would say that's not true. There's no inflammation in healthy tissues like that. But it turns out that it can work. And you're welcome to look at the lecture notes to see how that works. All right, so we can use a theory like that to test the plausibility of ideas. And you can prove, in fact, that this is an evolutionarily stable strategy. What does that mean? It means that there is no mutant, missensing mutant, that can invade. It grows faster than wild-type cells. And so wild-type cells, which are not mutant, are stable against invasion by any mutant. They have, there is an interesting thing that happens. If you're born with a mutation in all your cells, the immune system can't tell which one is hypersecreting, and the entire organ secretes too much. And that's what happens when you're born with, let's say, congenital hyperinsulinemia, a mutation where all the cells in your beta cells are making too much, and then you're born with very low glucose. You have to cut off the pancreas in order to save this baby. So it's also a density-dependent effect where when the mutants are still very, very small number, the T cells can eliminate them. If they take over or become too large in a certain region, the T cells can't tell which cell is different from each other and can't work anymore. Probably what happens in these toxic nodules once they evade somehow this ASHM and get to a critical size, and then it's very difficult for the immune system to work, even though these toxic nodules do have inflammation on the side, so the immune system is trying to work on them. Yeah. So we're building this theory, and now, basically, I hope now you're convinced there's a theory of what is the logic of having autoimmune disease. I mean, you have this self-reactive T cell, but why doesn't everybody get autoimmune disease? Right? Why do some people get them and some people don't? Good question. Why doesn't everybody get autoimmune disease? So we know that something triggers autoimmune disease because so there's autoimmune disease, like type 1 diabetes, Hashimoto's, etc., has a genetic risk factor. For instance, HLA, DR3 or 4, these are mutations, variants, very common variants, in the kind of platters that present antigens, not on normal cells, on antigen-presenting cells, and they have to do with B cells. It's a kind of MHCs, class 2 cells. These are immunological details. It's not critical right now. But 30% of the population has these variants, and everyone with autoimmune disease has these variants. So if you have them, doesn't mean you'll get autoimmune disease, but if you get autoimmune disease, most likely you have these variants. Genetic twins, identical monozygotic twins. If one gets, let's say, type 1 diabetes, the other one has a 50% chance to get, which means it's not only genetics. There's something else, stochastic or environmental, that's at play. It's not only genetics. People think also that you also need something like a virus infection or bacterial infection that attacks the thyroid, let's say, and secretes those antigens. And so this creates a signal for that there's a virus, alarm signal, plus antigen that's spilled out by the attack. And this, if you have the genetic background, can lead to the autoimmune disease where basically the T cells think that thyroglobulin is a viral protein and start attacking the thyroid cells. Why are these disease-causing risk factor variants so prevalent, 30%? Why didn't they disappear with time? So one theory is that it's balancing selection, that they do predispose you to autoimmune disease, but they also have a useful role, which is they make the immune system more easily triggered by pathogens, by viruses and bacteria. So maybe in the past, where there are a lot of viruses and bacteria, individuals that have this easily triggered immune system could do better against viruses at the cost of having autoimmune disease. And so that's what I can say about the causes. It could be, I mean, it's known that these variants do activate with these thyroglobulin receptors, they activate more strongly. There are some theories that they cause regulatory T cells to die more with high antigen. There's lots of like different theories about what goes wrong. But what I'm trying to tell you, especially today, is not how it turns into disease, but the physiological role that's a counterpart to autoimmune disease. It's so essential that there's a fragility to autoimmune disease. So that's about why not everybody gets autoimmune diseases. And now I want to reach the final question in this lecture: rules for which organs get autoimmune disease and which don't. Okay, so we look at the thyroid. This gets Hashimoto. On top of the thyroid, there's the parathyroid. No autoimmune disease, except in rarely when you take immune checkpoint inhibitors against cancer, or you have these air diseases, thyroid diseases. There's no autoimmune disease. The theory here predicts something very interesting. An organ with no autoimmune disease, autoimmune, probably has no or weak ASHM, and therefore has weak surveillance against mutants. And that organ, therefore, should have more toxic nodules, adenomas, hypersecreting Crohn disease. So let's look at the parathyroid gland. Does it have a lot of hypersecreting mutant diseases? Indeed, it does. 2% of postmenopausal women have too much parathyroid hormone. This disease is called, it has the elegant name, hyperparathyroidism. Too much calcium at the expense of bones. Bones is a deterioration. Calcium makes the brain less focused. It has some symptoms. The treatment is to cut away the tumor, remove the tumor, and usually works fine. But notice that it's like there's a trade-off. Either you have autoimmune disease or mutant expansion. Either you have hypo, too little because you lose the hormone, or hyper because you have secretion. I want to give another example. We looked at the adrenal gland, and there's a certain kind of adenoma that gives you too much cortisol. This is called Cushing's disease. Is there an end to the list of diseases? But there's two ways to get Cushing disease. You can get them from an adenoma in the adrenal, or you can get them from a hypersecreting adenoma that makes too much X2. And therefore you have too much cortisol. So either a primary or pituitary adenoma. Virtually the same disease. Too much cortisol, fat distribution in the face and back, hypertension, diabetes, depression, treatment, removal of the tumor. Fine. But check this out. The adrenal is 10 grams. The pituitary cells that secrete X2, 0.1 grams. So there's 100 times less cells in the pituitary. Which one of these is more common? You'd expect that if there's more cells in the adrenal, they have much more mutations. This is 10 times more common. This kind of disease, the pituitary adenoma, is 10 times more common. So that means 1,000 times more mutants like that per cell in the pituitary than in the adrenal. The adrenal has autoimmune diseases. The pituitary has no autoimmune disease, maybe 500 cases in history of autoimmune disease in pituitary. It's an immune protected site. There's virtually no autoimmune diseases there. So this goes with this rule. No autoimmune disease in the pituitary, 1,000 times more probability of a toxic adenoma. Okay? So I hope I explained myself. And on. Alpha cells. Now, from this list, we can talk about alpha cells. So this has autoimmune disease. Alpha cells have no autoimmune disease. So we can predict that they'll have mutant expansion diseases. Too much glucagon, which means more glucose, which is like type 2 diabetes. So maybe this is an unknown disease, you can say, that you can predict, and could be a fraction of type 2 diabetes, a very common disease, might be hyperproliferation, hyperplasia of alpha cells. And there is known hyperplasia of alpha cells that gives type 2 diabetes, but it's not thought of as a toxic adenoma or something like that. But we can use this theory to predict basically new diseases in new organs. And I just want to say that a kind of a rule emerges from here. If we look at the organs that have autoimmune disease and don't have autoimmune disease, there's a kind of a rule that emerges with just the number of cells in the organ. The logic is, if you have a lot of cells, like a 10 to the 10 cells, you'll have a lot of mutants, and you need ASHM, autoimmune disease. If you have a tiny organ, 0.1 gram, there's so much fewer mutations because fewer cell divisions, you don't need ASHM, and you take the risk for an age-related toxic adenoma after you reproduce. So the rule is, this is the number of cells. So this is so I'm going to write here 10 to the 9, that's about 1 gram of cells, 10 to the 10, 10 to the 11, 10 to the 8, 10 to the 7. This is 0.1 gram. Yeah. So here are beta cells, and here's the adrenal and the thyroid. So in this range of 1 to 10 grams, you have autoimmune diseases. Here, we have the pituitary cells. We have the renin-secreting cells in the kidney, et cetera, et cetera. Here we have parathyroid gland, with a total of about 0.1 gram. Parathyroid gram, tiny. Like if the pituitary is 10 centimeters, the parathyroid, the glands are the size of a grain of rice. So here we have toxic adenoma. What happens above it? So you see there, it's like a periodic table almost, right? So you see like what happens when you have number of cells above 10 grams. So there are hormone tissues like that, for instance, the prostate, or secretory tissues, which secretes. It's about 30 grams, and you have secretory glands with the same circuit, which are higher. Above 10 grams, you can imagine there's so many mutants, you would need so much ASHM that everyone will get autoimmune diseases. I mean, like thyroid is already 5%. What happened? And by the way, thyroid also gets toxic nodules. So the ASHM is just barely working. I mean, 1% people get toxic nodules. It's not, you can't raise it more. Above, the cells switch from cells that make themselves to stem cells that make themselves and make the cells. And these stem cells are really dangerous because they're such great dividing cells, they can turn into cancer cells. So you see cancer at high masses. And so you can see it's a function of number of cells. A rule where you go from toxic adenomas to autoimmune disease to cancer is a function of the number of divisions, lifetime divisions, you can say, or number of cells. That's one kind of rule. What's that? Yeah, so somebody asked, there are common autoimmune diseases in the brain, kidney, and now you just wrote that answers that. In the kidney, there is autoimmune disease, but of a specific cell type that weighs above 1 gram. That's called the podocytes in the kidney. So it's a cell type specifically, not a whole organ thing. But things like liver and pancreas and lung, they get cancer more than they get autoimmune disease of this particular type. Absolutely, yeah. And by the way, the more cell divisions in the organ, the more stem cell divisions in the organ, the more cancer. So big organs like the skin weighs a few kilos, lungs have more cancer than smaller organs, and fast-dividing organs exposed to damage like skin, lung epithelium get more cancer than organs that are slowly dividing like liver. But it's almost a linear correlation between risk of cancer and number of lifetime stem cell divisions in these kind of organs that have stem cells. And that's a very famous paper by Vogelstein that had a lot of criticism, but overall it seems to work. So cancer rates go up with number of lifetime stem cell divisions, basically with the mass of the organ and its turnover time. Different organs have different turnover time. Skin cells, let's say a month, red blood cells 3 months, liver 1 year, beta cells, thyroid cells a month more or less. So, and that depends on their function. Also, the mass depends on the function. And so we have a picture here. And I just want to finish that there's another piece of the rule is that if we think of this trade-off between autoimmune disease and toxic adenoma, this is hyper and this is hypo because you lose the hormone. So you can think that if hypo, no hormone, it depends what you can think also, not only the mass, but also what's worse, too much hormone or too little hormone. That's also can play a role. So for example, sometimes it's not clear, like in the case of pituitary, it's always too much cortisol here, so that doesn't help you here. But if you think about insulin, for example, hypo, no insulin, means you'll have at old age, you'll have some glucose damage and type 2 diabetes, basically. No insulin. Or low insulin, let's say. And too much insulin, toxic adenoma, hyper is basically low glucose and you die right away. So it's not exactly the same. And that's why, so basically, what I'm trying to say is that the toxic adenoma of insulin is deadly for babies. That's why having ASHM and saving 99% of the population at the risk of 1% dying from autoimmune disease makes sense evolutionarily. Evolution doesn't evolve to make us healthy, doesn't evolve to make us happy, it evolves us to make us make more grandchildren, basically. And so in this cold calculation, the balance between hyper and hypo also plays a role, as well as the number of cells. That's towards having rules, which organs get autoimmune disease, this kind of autoimmune disease, and which don't. So I'd like to give you a musical summary of this lecture. I'm just a T cell, my story is seldom told, educated in the thymus. I learned how to defend my country, laying low, seeking out those lymph nodes where the other T cells go, seeking out the places only they will know. When I first came to the thyroid, I saw a lot of thyroid cells while making thyroid hormone. Then I saw a hyper-secreting mutant, making so much thyroglobulin, it threatened to become a hyper-secreting clone. I pulled out my dagger, did what a T cell has to do. 9-9, 9-9, 9-9, 9-9, 9-9, 9-9, 9-9. Oh, I hope those hyper-secreting mutants don't expand and form a clone. Make me call in the B-cell army. Start a civil war with brother cell killing brother cell. This we must avoid. After all, I am a pacifist. 9-9, 9-9, 9-9, 9-9. Thank you very much, and we'll meet again next week as we go into the final stretch of Hormone Circuits. So I wish you a great week. Take a nice deep sigh of relief. Goodbye.